Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Women's Diaries Voice, we retell those moments, honest every day, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. My name is Lena Ashford, 34, and the first time my father said it out loud, he didn't bother lowering his voice. You were never the grandchild he could brag about. Victor told me, his mouth set in that practiced courthouse smile. The remark landed in a conference room of smoked glass and oil paintings high above Market Street, where the Philadelphia firm Harland and Colton shepherded families through tidy grief. My aunt shifted in her chair. My cousin pretended to study the skyline. I kept my eyes on the legal pads, breathing through the sting the way you learn to breathe through a stitch in your side, slow, measured, training your body not to flinch. If you had met my grandfather, you would not have expected any of this. Edmund Ashford built Northbridge Holdings out of a two-man crew rehabbing row houses along the Schuylkill. By the time I was old enough to tie my hair back without help, his company was stitching whole neighborhoods together. Mixed-use blocks with bakeries and bike shops and roofs that didn't leak when the wind came hard out of the river. He used to say the work was part carpentry, part cartography. We build, he'd tell me, but first we read a city like a map. I learned my first blueprints at his workshop by the water. Not some storybook lake house, but a low brick building that smelled like cut pine and coffee burnt past good manners. Summers, he let me ink the title blocks, project name, scale date. When the light slanted in late afternoon, we would roll the plans, stow them in tubes, and walk the site with a measuring wheel that clicked and sang. He'd quiz me on setbacks, easements, floodlines, on why a corner lot sells faster, and who benefits from a stoop deep enough for 2 chairs. Arteries and capillaries, he'd explain, tapping a map of transit stops. Money is just blood flow. Find where it clots and where it starves. At home, I'd copy columns of numbers from his quarterly reports, not really understanding the ratios yet, only that the figures told a story if you were patient with them. Later in high school, we detoured into old-world craftsmanship, not rare novels, but rare maps, surveyor's tools, and hand-forged hardware. We hunted rolled charts of the Delaware from the 19th century, compasses with rose-engraved faces, hinges that swung like whispers. Edmund taught me to tell machine-made patina from the slow honesty of time. At 16, I rebuilt a sash window with him, oak rails, wavy glass rope and pulley, and he made me sign the inside style like a painter signs a canvas. If you won't put your name on it, don't do it, he said, not as a command but as a standard. My younger sister Sloane lived on a different calendar altogether. She tried economics for a semester, then communications, then art history, flirting with each subject like a brunch place you only visit once for the photos. She loved Northbridge, the way people love stadiums, because they're backdrops for bigger feelings. Her texts to Edmund were shopping lists with sentimental frosting, a white SUV for safety, a 2-week yoga retreat for mental health, a bag with initials, so I look professional. He was generous, but he believed in gravity. Things ought to have weight, he told me after the Christmas she cried about the wrong trim package on a car. Otherwise, they just float off. Weight, responsibility, consequence was precisely what my father resented in Edmund. Victor had gone to law school to outgrow the neighborhood that made him. He liked stages, charity galas, ribbon cuttings, the part in the speech where you raise your chin half an inch and let the cameras catch you listening. Edmund kept postponing any talk of handing over the company. He hears applause, Edmund said once gently, but he doesn't always hear the room. My mother, Helen, would step between the two men with soft directives. Sit, please. Eat before you argue, as if food could mortar a gap that had been widening for years. She'd given up teaching studio art when Sloane was born, and sometimes smoothed quarrels the way she smoothed gesso over canvas. All patience, no complaint. The year Edmund turned 78, we started meeting in shorter bursts. His cardiologist insisted on it. He hated the way the hospital smelled like boiled linens, so we met at the workshop with the big door rolled up, air moving straight through like a river. Those meetings weren't sentimental. He had me chair 3 small board sessions so I could feel how a room shifts when you stop being the note-taker. He walked me through loan covenants until I could recite them backwards. We drew out succession diagrams with 3 different pen colors, roles, timelines, contingency triggers. On a gray Tuesday in early April, he squeezed my fingers and said, "Guard the long view." Then more quietly, "And guard what's yours. People reach when they're frightened." I thought he meant developers who cut corners, not family. The call woke me at 3:07 a.m. Helen's voice was a small, bright thing trying not to break. "Lena, she said your grandfather." She didn't finish the sentence. The silence did it for her. I walked the kitchen phone pressed so hard against my ear it hurt, trying to put time back where it had been 5 minutes earlier. On the counter lay a stack of marked-up pro formas he'd sent me the previous afternoon. His notes were as tidy as always, Arrow's questions a joke about my terrible handwriting. Edmund's funeral filled the stone nave of St. Bartholomew's, a church he had raised money to restore when the roof threatened to fail. Contractors came in their good boots. Kids from a youth center he'd funded came in borrowed ties. Victor delivered eulogy lines that sounded right on paper and wrong in the mouth, emphasizing syllables as if sincerity were a punctuation mark. Sloane kept her phone face down, but within reach, the screen throbbing with little storms of light she pretended not to see. Grief carries a drift of unease with it. You can't trust the way details stick. But certain things lodged too cleanly. Victor's relief at the reception, not jubilation exactly, but a loosening, as if something heavy had rolled off his chest. His hand lingering on a painting in Edmund's study, an old riverscape of barges like a man checking a safe behind a canvas. When I asked to borrow photographs for a display memorial at Northbridge, he blocked the doorway. "That room is sealed," he said, "pending legal review." I reminded him Edmund had told me where his personal papers were. Victor smiled the way lawyers smile at questions that are not in fact questions. "There will be a process," he said. Jackson Moore, the lawyer who'd represented our family for 3 decades, pulled me aside near the coffee urns. He had made a career of looking unsurprised. That afternoon, for the first time, he looked tired. "We'll talk before the reading," he murmured. Privately. Before we could arrange anything, Victor clapped a heavy palm on his shoulder and steered him toward the mayor's aide, who just arrived with a bouquet big enough to be a hedge. Back at Edmund's workshop, where I slept on a sofa the color of old maps, I tried to comfort myself with tasks. I labeled bankers' boxes. I sorted invoices into crisp stacks. In the morning, Helen and I brewed coffee so strong it bit. She rinsed the pot twice before saying, "Your father and Edmund didn't agree about the future." The way she said agree made it sound like weather. Try not to judge while it's still this raw. She was doing what she always did, taking the sharp out of words until they could be swallowed. I kissed her cheek and went looking for proof that my unease was not only grief trying to reorganize the world. Victor's home office was rarely unlocked. That day, the door hung on its latch. His desk, typically neat enough to reflect, had been used like a staging area. Open file folders, a legal pad, with the first 2 words of a sentence written and rewritten until the fibers gave out. Under a folded newspaper, I found a torn note in Edmund's slanted block printing. "Restructure protections. Update directives. L." The rest had been ripped away in a hurry. I put the scrap in my pocket and told myself it meant nothing because anything could mean everything, and that way madness lay. I watched Victor take phone calls in the driveway at odd hours, engine off eyes sliding along hedge lines as though the shrubbery might be wired. When I caught my reflection in his car window one night, he startled and closed the call, holding up his key fob like a talisman. "Couldn't find the flashlight," he said. Power flickered. The power had not flickered. Small cruelties sprouted in unlikely places. In Edmund's den, the inscription beneath a photograph from my graduation, "For Lena, who reads the city," had been scored through with a single deliberate line. In a frame shot from a Northbridge anniversary gala, someone had taped a business card neatly over my face. I would have blamed grief for the imagination required to make a pattern from coincidence, except the card belonged to a partner at Harland and Colton. The evening before the will was to be read, we ate at my parents' place roast chicken. Too much rosemary, the table set with wedding gift china that only came out for holidays and strategic truce dinners. Victor raised his glass to new chapters. Sloane clinked crystal and said too brightly that she had been reading about corporate governance. Helen moved peas around her plate as if hunger were a game she could win by refusing to play. After I loaded the dishwasher, I told my mother, "Something is off." She washed and rewound the dishcloth, hands busy. "Give it time," she said. "Paperwork has its own speed." When she left to answer the doorbell, and Ho-Shop delivery lilies so white they glowed, I slipped back to the office, memorized the way the papers lay, as if that could be a kind of protection, then left everything exactly as I'd found it. When I reached the workshop, I stacked files on the drafting table, lined up pencils in a row, and tried not to read the torn note again. Morning came thin and colorless. I put on a navy dress that made me look less tired, pinned my hair, and took the elevator to the 32nd floor, where Harland and Colton kept their views and their secrets. The receptionist's voice was sounded smooth. "Ms. Ashford, they're ready for you." I smoothed the hem of my jacket and followed her past framed newspaper clippings about landmark deals, past a glass case, holding a ceremonial gavel, into a room where the city lay behind the windows, like a photograph you could step into, and every chair waited with the kind of silence that asks for signatures. The senior partner was already seated when I entered, a woman with silver hair cut in a precise bob and a lapel pin shaped like a tiny gavel. "Ms. Ashford," she said, rising half an inch. "Miriam Colton, please accept our condolences." Her voice had the polished calm of a person who navigates grief for a living. Chairs creaked. My father nodded to the room as if he'd organized the whole day. Sloane slid into a seat opposite me and, without looking up, thumbed her phone into airplane mode like an act of generosity. My mother folded her hands, eyes low. Along the far wall, a case displayed framed clippings about landmark deals, Harborside Towers lit at dusk, a ribbon-cutting line bright with teeth. Ms. Colton drew a slim leather folder toward her. "We'll begin with preliminaries." She recited obligations, notification procedures, the dull but necessary lattice that holds end-of-life decisions in place. The heir inched forward. Small bequests rolled by a donation to the vocational trades program. Edmund had championed scholarships for surveyors in training, a gift to the Historical Society to preserve river charts he loved. Aunt Marianne received the little collection of marine barometers that had ticked softly in Edmund's den. 2 cousins were assigned modest cash gifts in recognition of summer work of good spirit. The lake-adjacent parcel he'd once thought about developing went to my mother because she kept people warm. Then the room changed. Regarding controlling interest in Northbridge Holdings, Ms. Colton said, eyes moving from the page to the faces arrayed around the table, and the residue of the estate Edmund Ashford bequeaths to his granddaughter. Sloane Ashford, all voting shares, all rights, attendant to those shares, and the family residence subject to standard conditions. The sentence held until it didn't. Something fell away inside my chest, not the clean drop of a roller coaster, but a stagger, the floor briefly failing. My father leaned back, smiling the way he smiled when a judge sustained one of his objections. Edmund made the practical choice he announced to no one in particular. He didn't want his company frozen by indecision. Sloane's chin lifted. "I've already been speaking with Stonefield Partners," she said, casual as discussing lunch reservations. "They'd like to explore an acquisition package. They're proposing a swift integration, keep the brand, streamline the rest." Words scraped in my throat. I swallowed them back. Across the table, Ms. Colton turned a page and placed a single sheet in a transparent stand, a signature page displayed like a specimen under glass. I didn't intend to stand, but I did. The signature sat where it always sits, lower. Right? Edmund's name sweeping outward with a long tail on the last letter. Except the tail didn't lift. The loop on the capital E was pinched too tight, the pressure points wrong. The faint tremor he'd developed in his index finger in recent years, imitated but not understood. It looked like handwriting the way a wax fruit looks like fruit. A touch grazed my sleeve. I turned and found Nora Keene Edmonds, executive assistant for 25 years, standing behind my chair. She had a knack for occupying space the way a houseplant does, present, quiet, oxygenating everything. "Ms. Ashford," she murmured, almost without moving her lips. When I glanced down, a folded receipt lay against my palm, warm from her hand. 3 words inked in tidy script, River Garden. 10. Ms. Ashford. Ms. Colton said gently, "If you'd like a moment." "I'm fine," I said too quickly. We went on. There were housekeeping items, then acknowledgement of receipt forms clipped to pens longer than necessary. My father turned to me. "You'll want to sign these quitclaims while everyone's present. It avoids confusion. Not today, I said. My office has prepared a release for your role at Northbridge, he continued. Transitional matters are time-sensitive. Then you'll manage them, I told him. As I gathered my bag, he spoke again, voice pitched for the room. You've always struggled with acceptance, Lena. This is an opportunity to demonstrate grace. I looked past him to the window, the city laid out in patient blocks, and found a reflection of my own face that didn't flinch. I'll have counsel contact the firm, I said, and walked out. The elevator sealed with a hush. In that capsule of brushed steel, I let air in until my lungs remembered their work. By the time the door slid open to the lobby, the breath had learned a steadier rhythm. Back at the workshop, I turned the drafting table into a war surface. Bankers' boxes opened their mouths. Folders marched into rows. I emptied a tote of things Edmund had left under the workbench the week before he died. 2 rolled site maps, a tin of leads, an index card with a grocery list. Coffee twine, asked Nora about HEIR. At 2 a.m., I found the courage to call Grace Lau Northbridge's longtime controller, whose voicemail usually returned within minutes. An assistant answered instead, and after a pause said Ms. Lau was unavailable until further notice. Another pause, a soft click, the line gone. At 9:59 the next morning, I pushed into River Garden Cafe, a narrow place that smelled like rosemary and steam. Nora sat at a corner table with a glass of water untouched. She rose, then sat again as if to spare me ceremony. I can't stay long, she said, but I won't let you be the last to know the truth. The receipt between us was a bridge. I crossed it. That signature I began isn't his, she finished quietly. Edmund signed a different will. Here. From her bag, she produced a business card so plain it could have been a decoy. David Rios, attorney at law. A Cambridge address above a secondhand bookshop was printed in small type. Private counsel, I asked. She nodded. Last fall, your father started urging changes he said would prevent drift at the company. Edmund didn't want a confrontation inside Northbridge or at Harland and Colton, so he asked me to help him retain Mr. Rios separately. It isn't unusual for someone with Edmund's profile to compartmentalize. He signed his will there on April 17th. I witnessed it. The other witness was the notary who rents the office above the shop. Edmund insisted on a conservative chain of custody. My coffee arrived. I didn't touch it. Why keep it quiet? Because the noise would have come early, Nora said. And he needed time to finish onboarding you. He thought a private signing would give him those weeks. I exhaled. Did he talk to you about Sloan? Nora's careful face altered by degrees. He talked about both of you. He respected your work. He was fond of your sister and also worried. He said she loved outcomes, but not the carpentry that creates them. The door chimed. 2 construction workers in neon vests ducked in for muffins. Outside, a delivery truck idled with a sound like distant surf. What happens now? I asked, then corrected myself. I'm going to Mr. Rios. Bring what you have, Nora said. Edmund kept copies of everything, but more is better. I paid the check and walked into a morning bright enough to squint. Mr. Rios's office smelled like paper and graphite and something good cooking on a floor below. He was in his 50s, compact, with a prosecutor's habit of choosing words like he was laying track one after another, fixed and useful. Your grandfather came to me to create redundancy, he said, after introductions producing a file thick enough to bend the desk blotter. He speculated accurately. It seems that changes executed through his primary firm might be contested or reinterpreted. He wanted a direct witnessed record of his intentions. He laid the April 17th will on a pad and let me read. The words steadied something loose in me. The structure was what Edmund would build if asked to draw a structure around fairness. A provision for my mother independent of marital property. Voting control of Northbridge to me with oversight from a temporary stewardship committee comprised of 2 outside directors until the first annual meeting. Smaller bequests to employees who had worked beyond their job descriptions for years. A trust for Sloan that required and funded through a separate account completion of coursework in financial management before distributions. And paragraphs written in Edmund's voice about why stewardship wasn't a throne. When I reached the last page, I recognized his signature as surely as I would have recognized his footsteps on the workshop stairs. The loop on the E swung wide and then narrowed. The tail rose at the end, a stubborn, optimistic stroke. He asked me to hold the original, Rios said. He took a certified copy home and told me he had a secure spot. He left with a list of to-dos. One of those was meeting with Dr. Priya Deshmukh, a forensic document examiner he'd used on a vendor dispute last year. He said if anyone ever asked whether he'd signed something, he wanted enough exemplars on file to make the answer boring. I smiled despite myself. Of course he did. Rios reached for another folder. I've already contacted Dr. Deshmukh. She has samples of his hand from the past 5 years and can perform a comparative analysis on the signature Harland and Colton displayed. He paused. We'll need that specimen. I can get it. I pictured the transparent stand the way the light had caught the ridge in the paper. Ms. Colton won't obstruct access to copies. She shouldn't, Rios said. In the meantime, one question: has anything at the workshop or office been disturbed? I told him about the scored inscription in the den and the business card taped over my face at the gala photo. He wrote both down, not as curiosities, but as data points, and then made a second list: names, locations, dates to contact and verify. He had the steady patience of a person who collects drops and trusts what they'll become. On my way out, he handed me a legal envelope, a letter he said addressed to you. Mr. Ashford asked me to hold it until we'd spoken. I waited until I was back at the workshop to slide a butter knife under the flap. Edmund's handwriting slanted left the ink a little watery where his pen had skipped. Lena, if this reaches you, it means the quiet route failed. You'll know what to do with the paper. Nora. Mr. Rios, and the facts are enough. There were 2 more lines I read twice and then put back in their place. Facts. I started collecting them like a person mops a floor after the pipe bursts quickly on instinct, knowing the volume will beat you if you don't keep moving. I pulled invoices for the months bracketed around April 17th. I printed email confirmations for courier runs. I found the thumb drive Edmund always kept in a little brass dish by the drill press, an old thing with a slider that stuck, and opened it on the workshop computer. There were backups of board agendas, the draft stewardship bylaws, a scan of a hand-sketched succession diagram with arrows that looked like a football coach's. In a folder named Old Hinges, I found security footage clips Edmund had labeled everything like a joke. The timestamp showed my father and sister letting themselves into Edmund's townhome 2 nights after the funeral. They came out 20 minutes later. Victor's jacket bulged oddly at the left side. At dusk, I returned to the townhome with Helen's spare key. Grief makes you treat rooms like museums. I moved with a reverence that felt like trespass, even if nothing I did was illegal. In the study, the riverscape hung level and lonely above the mantel. I checked beneath it drywall and dust. Then I walked the floor slowly, feet remembering where he'd said Joyce ran where creeks congregated. Near the window, the baseboard met a short stretch of bookshelf at a misaligned angle. I knelt, loosened 2 tiny brads with the smallest screwdriver in Edmund's bench kit, and eased back a piece of trim that didn't quite belong. Inside the cavity, a shallow fireproof tube nested like a bone. I unscrewed the cap. The smell rising out was all paper and time. There were 2 things inside: a certified copy of the April 17th will, with Rios's stamp, and an envelope marked with my name, the edges soft from being handled. Put down, picked up again. I stood, tube under my arm, and set both items on the drafting table back at the workshop. The will lay flat under a paperweight shaped like a ship's wheel. The letter I left unopened, a weight of its own. I labeled a fresh folder, slid the documents in, and drew a slow line of breath from nose to ribs to the place that had fallen away hours earlier. The line held. I did not open Edmund's second letter that night. I filed it beside the certified copy of the April 17th will and slept for 3 hours under the sound of the river working itself along the bulkheads. By morning, the workshop smelled like pencil shavings and resolve. David Rios met me at the door with a traveler mug and a legal pad already half filled. We'll move on 2 tracks, he said, fax and access. He sent a formal request to Harland and Colton. For copies of the signature page, they displayed the attestation clause and the notary log entry surrounding the version they had on file. He also drafted a notice to preserve electronic records, email metadata edits to any draft instruments, print logs addressed to both the firm and to my father as Edmund's nominal next of kin. The replies arrived in different voices. Harland and Colton acknowledged receipt with the antiseptic politeness of an institution that prides itself on procedure. My father responded through counsel, a partner at Calder and Finch, a litigation boutique whose letterhead looked like a fence. They framed our requests as overbroad fishing expeditions intended to manufacture doubt. Rios did not argue with a letter. He filed. The story broke before the filings reached the docket. A reporter at the City Ledger who had covered Northbridge ribbon cuttings for years ran a column under the headline, "Family Friction at Northbridge, Smooth Transitions Turn Rough." The quotes were careful, the sources anonymous, the thread obvious, a grieving granddaughter struggling to accept a patriarch's wisdom. Victor went on a morning radio show and worried aloud about my tendency to overwork, to catastrophize traits he admired but feared might tilt into rigidity. Sloan offered a statement about honoring vision while modernizing. I switched my phone to silent and watched my inbox fill with neutral platitudes from people who wanted to be counted on whichever side won. Rios kept me at the workbench of the case. He introduced me to Dr. Priya Deshmukh, who arrived at the workshop with a rolling case of lenses and lights, and a warmth that took the sting out of fluorescent bulbs. She examined the signature I had photographed in Ms. Colton's conference room, cross-referencing it with Edmund's checks contracts and a dozen holiday cards he had signed to the neighborhood youth center. "See here," she said, enlarging the loop on Edmund's E until it filled the screen. "Your grandfather had a microtremor. It strikes most on downstrokes. Whoever wrote this tried to insert a tremor uniformly. That's not how a hand misbehaves." She traced pressure points with a pen tip, showing where the ball of a hand would rest on paper, how ink collects when a wrist tires. "These aren't an elderly man's hesitations, they're a younger hand's imitations." She took the high-resolution images and my scan of the Harland and Colton specimen and promised to report without adornment. When she left the room, felt briefly larger, as if clarity itself had pried open the air. The preliminary hearing took place the following week in a courtroom paneled in walnut and hung with a portrait of a judge whose name the plaque had turned green. The clerk called Ashford v. Colton et al., and the echo dusted the back benches. Judge Avery Harlan, a woman with gray hair worn like a crown she had no time to polish, looked over her glasses as if she could see the skeleton of every motion. She asked few questions, and each one hit like a nail struck true. Calder and Finch argued that wills must be stable structures, not sandcastles rebuilt at grief's whim. Rios answered with the certified copy from April 17th, the notary's seal like a neat bruise, and with affidavits from the notary and from Nora Keene attesting to the private signing. He summarized what we would prove with discovery irregularities in the later instrument, the existence of duplicate chains, a timeline that made the public signing impossible without a rehearsal of fraud. Judge Harlan set a tight schedule. "Facts first," she said. "I'll have none of the theater." Theater came anyway in the hallways. A local cable station aired footage of me walking beside Rios and ran it under a banner about inheritance wars. 2 days later, the Ledger ran an op-ed calling me a throwback to the old guard who would stifle innovation. The author was a consultant whose firm had pitched Stonefield Partners in the past. The correction, when it came, lived on page A13. The headline on the front page did not. Depositions began. We started with the official narrative. Miriam Colton's testimony was unembellished. She said, relied on documents presented to her with proper formalities from people she had no reason to distrust. When Rios asked about internal discussions concerning Edmund's expressed intention to create a stewardship plan centered on me, she tightened her mouth. Privilege. When he asked whether the firm had run authenticity checks in light of those past discussions, she admitted they had not. In retrospect, she said a lawyer's word for regret we might have. Calder and Finch produced a home health nurse who had tended Edmund for 2 days during a hospital observation in March. She testified that she heard me remind Edmund to sign the papers we discussed, which she took to mean a will. Rios asked for specifics, the room number, the time, the angle of the sun, and then showed the nurse a schedule indicating that I had been leading a board workshop on those days, complete with attendee affidavits and a time-stamped photo of me holding up a marker at a whiteboard while a director laughed at my attempt at a pie chart. The nurse frowned, but the transcript can't capture a frown. It only holds words. Then it was Sloane's turn. She arrived at Rios's conference room in cream and gold, looking like an advertisement for a life that took magnolia trees for granted. Calder and Finch had prepped her well. She expressed sorrow, framed her meetings with Stonefield as exploratory, and described her relationship with Edmund as warm, if not technical. Rios let her talk. After an hour of generalities, he slid across the table a stack of bank records bearing Northbridge letterhead and a series of personal transfers to an account called Linnea Projects. "What is Linnea Projects?" he asked. "A mood board," she said, the corners of her mouth playing confidence. "I keep ideas there. It appears to be a Delaware LLC," Rios said, "funded through a vendor account that does not correspond to any approved vendor. These transfers occur in increments designed to avoid automatic flagging thresholds." Her eyes flickered a change you might miss if you were not trained to watch for small weather. "I don't handle minutia," she said lightly. "Our team did." He placed in front of her a printout of her own emails to a personal assistant, instructing how to title the transfers and on what days to make them. He asked nothing for a moment, as if the silence itself could do the work. When he did speak, it was to ask for the password to Linnea Projects. She didn't remember. The judge would later compel production. Memory is elastic. Orders are not. Victor's deposition was a study in poise and fracture. He began with a narrative about paternal concern about a father protecting one daughter from the other's ambition. Rios let him draw the room he wanted to live in. Then he opened the workshop laptop and played a clip from the folder labeled Old Hinges. The footage was black and white and tilted slightly, the camera mounted where a ceiling beam met a wall. In it, Victor and Sloane stepped into Edmund's townhome 2 nights after the funeral. Victor wore the jacket I recognized. Its left side bulged. They moved through the study and left 20 minutes later. Victor's hand was on the small of Sloane's back, an old habit guiding her as if through a crowd that wasn't there. "Mr. Ashford," Rios said. "Why were you in Edmund's home after midnight? Who let you in?" "My father had given me a key years ago," he said smoothly. "And the item under your jacket?" "I had nothing under my jacket." Rios paused the video at a frame where the bulge caught a streak of light and became undeniably three-dimensional. The room was quiet the way a room is quiet when people stop pretending to breathe. Victor looked at the screen, then at me, then past both of us as if a window existed on a wall where there was none. "You're misreading pixels," he said. "Compression artifact." Dr. Deschmuke's report arrived 2 days later, stamped and bound. She listed 17 points of divergence between the Harland and Colton signature and Edmund's established hand. She included magnified images of the forger's hesitation at the tail of the final letter, an effort to create an upward flick that an untrained hand thought decorative, and that Edmund's hand produced like muscle memory only when certain phrases pulled him forward. Her conclusion was plain: the signature on the public will was not Edmund's. If someone had asked for drama, there was none to give. Rios filed the report and noticed of our intent to use it. Calder and Finch filed a motion to strike it as speculative. Judge Harlan denied the motion from the bench without sitting down. We asked the court to order access to Harland and Colton's printer logs for the week surrounding the public will's execution. The firm produced neatly labeled packets. Rios spread them across his office table like aerial photos of a coastline. The logs showed multiple prints of the signature page within a tight window late at night. They also showed deletions the next morning that IT later recovered with the indifference of a process built for exactly this kind of resurrection. Someone had created a PDF with a signature embedded over a scanned page, printed it twice, adjusted brightness, and printed again. The login credentials belonged to a junior associate who, questioned under oath, said she had stayed late and followed instructions to prepare exhibits. When asked whose instructions, she said, "I was told the partners." I assumed Ms. Colton's. Ms. Colton denied it. The associate looked small and sick and 27. My mother sat with me in the back row of the next hearing, a soft scarf looped twice around her throat, as if to hold in heat. Rios led with chronology, then with paper, then with pixels. He asked for a formal invalidation of the public will, and for the court to recognize the April 17th instrument as Edmund's last testament. Calder and Finch countered with insinuation, a suggestion of undue influence that they tried to dress in concern. They called the nurse again. They waved at the radio interviews as if good PR were good proof. Judge Harlan tasked an independent guardian ad litem to review Edmund's medical records. Dr. Renee Alvarez, Edmund's cardiologist, testified curtly that Edmund's cognition was intact through April. He forgot names at parties. Dr. Alvarez said not the terms of loans. In the days that folded around those hearings, I finally opened the second letter. Edmund's hand was more tired here, the lines shorter. If the room grows loud, keep your voice where it lives. Don't lean on rage. It breaks. Use the table. Put everything on it. Under the lines was a small sketch. Our old measuring wheel, its increments marked by his fussy little hash lines, the handle tall enough to reach a girl's shoulder. I put the letter back in its envelope and slid it behind the ship's wheel paperweight. The Guardian Ad Litem's report returned. It was dry in the way a useful thing is dry. It found no evidence of diminished capacity in April. It did find notes from an office visit in late May, in which Edmund had asked for a copy of his advance directive and discussed family pressure. In the margin, the physician had written PT-oriented X3 confident. Wolf at door. The physician did not remember writing the joke. The ink remembered for him. On a gray Monday, Jackson Moore, the family lawyer who had served us so long, he felt like furniture, called Rios and asked to speak. He came into the workshop late, his tie loose in the rain, tapping the big door like a polite visitor. I owe him more than my silence, he said by way of greeting. Rios handed him tea and a seat and let air fill the rest. Jackson's story fit like a missing joist. Edmund had told him in January that he planned to execute a will privately to avoid interference. He had asked Jackson to maintain normal appearances with Harland and Colton, and with Victor to keep muscle memory alive so no one would suspect detours. After the funeral, Victor had pressed Jackson to expedite the formalities. He had presented the public will as if it were simply the long-expected draft. Jackson said he'd felt wrongness in the paper and in the speed. He hadn't known where to place that feeling. I was cowardly, he said, each syllable measured. I chose not to see. He reached into his briefcase and took out a sealed Redwell. Inside was a page Edmund had signed the day of the private execution, his name written 3 times each, with a different pen in front of a camera Jackson had set up to test a lens. Jackson had kept the page in his safe in case memory betrayed him. He had written the notary's commission number at the bottom. In his own hand, a man accustomed to leaving breadcrumbs for his future self, Rios thanked him and asked him to memorialize his account under oath. Jackson did the next morning in a deposition that left the court reporter blinking. Calder and Finch fought to exclude the redundancy page. Judge Harlan allowed it. They filed a motion for sanctions against us. She denied it. They widened their assertions of undue influence. Rios narrowed our record to what could be touched and weighed. On the morning set for final argument, Harland and Colton's lobby was a terrarium of umbrellas left to drip. The courtroom filled to the doors, contractors in clean boots. Northbridge staff in suits rescued from garment bags, a pair of high schoolers I recognized from the youth center's mentoring program, clutching notebooks as if they were passports. Sloan walked in wearing gray with no jewelry. Victor looked like a portrait of himself, everything in place. Judge Harlan took the bench and let the room settle. Rios stood and built our case, one plank at a time: the certified will, the attestation, the notary, the private counsel's file, the IT logs, Der Deschmuck's analysis, the video of the midnight visit, the bank records, the Guardian's medical review, Jackson Moore's testimony, the redundancy sheet bearing 3 exemplars and a date that would not move no matter how hard you pushed. Calder and Finch responded with a story about families and influence, about how affection can be a lever. They tried to turn Nora into a conspirator. She sat in the gallery with her hands folded, the tendons in her wrists like drawn lines. They tried to turn me into a symptom. I felt my mother lean slightly against my shoulder, as if she were shifting weight to a better balanced place. Rios reserved nothing. He asked for the relief our paper stated. He sat. The courtroom held a quiet I knew from job sites at Dawn Air, waiting metal smelling like weather. Judge Harlan flipped through her notes. She picked up the redundancy page and the Harland and Colton signature and laid them side by side. Her finger traced the tail of a letter as if following a river that knew its banks. She looked up, eyes moving once across the rows of faces as if counting us, and then reached for her gavel. The gavel's first tap was light, like a knuckle on a door you already mean to open. This court finds Judge Harlan said that the instrument presented through Harlan and Colton is invalid. The signature purporting to be Mr. Ashford's is not authentic. The attestation is compromised by irregular preparation and printing. The April 17th will executed under independent counsel properly witnessed and preserved is Mr. Ashford's last testament and shall be admitted. Air moved through the room, one long shared exhale. I felt my mother's hand find mine and rest there, not clinging, just present. Across the aisle, Sloane's shoulders sank as if a hidden harness had finally unbuckled. Victor stayed very still, his jaw set in the position he used for verdicts he intended to appeal. There will be referrals, the judge continued. The district attorney will review the matter of forgery and any related fraud. The bar will receive a record concerning conduct arising from the presentation of the invalid instrument. She did not look at Ms. Colton and did not have to. As to Northbridge Holdings voting control vests per the admitted will, any interim transfers are stayed. A stewardship committee shall convene as specified. She lifted the gavel once more. The second strike was decisive. Papers rustled, chairs scraped, the old murmur of people remembering how to stand. Rios packed our files with a calm that steadied the floor under me. When I turned, Nora was there, her expression a soft, exhausted smile. Jackson nodded once and looked away as if to ask forgiveness from a man who was no longer in the room. We walked out through a corridor loud with camera shutters. Microphones lifted, questions overlapped. Rios answered none of them. At the curb, he touched my elbow. "Office," he said. We moved the paperwork across the finish line. At Harlan and Colton the next afternoon, the tone had shifted. No views, no staged condolences, just a conference room and two paralegals who wanted signatures more than they wanted eye contact. Miriam Colton entered late, placed a set of files on the table with careful hands, and remained standing. "I regret the firm's failures," she said. "We should have verified what we were given." "We did not." Rios nodded without softening. "The court has spoken." She held my gaze for a single beat. It was an apology so much as acknowledgement, two lines drawn to show where a boundary had been. The stewardship committee convened in Northbridge's largest conference room, Edith Park, an outside director with a background in municipal finance, Harold Green, a retired builder who could read soil with a boot heel, and Rios until the first annual meeting. I took the seat at the head only because there was no other seat that made sense. The HVAC hummed. Someone had set a pitcher of water on the credenza without ice. We moved through the agenda entry of the admitted will into corporate records reinstatement of suspended projects, an interim freeze on discretionary spending that didn't touch payroll. Grace Lau called in from her kitchen, her voice steady, the clink of porcelain faintly audible when she set down a mug. Sloane sent a brief email through counsel acknowledging the ruling and asking for guidance about personal items at the office. The attachments showed receipts, an antique mirror she'd bought for the lobby with Northbridge funds, and a catering invoice for a tasting she'd called team building. I told Rios to coordinate return and restitution without theater. He said he would. Victor's house went quiet. Helen went to stay with a cousin for a week, then called me from the river, the wind flattening her words into a hush. "I'm coming by the workshop," she said. "I want to pack the paintings I stored in Edmund's rear office." "They're mine." "I'm allowed that." I told her I would meet her there and did, and we wrapped canvases in brown paper and tape until the room looked like a post office for ghosts. The district attorney moved faster than I expected. Investigators interviewed the junior associate about the printing logs, the nurse, about the radio retelling she'd absorbed into memory, the notary about April 17th. They asked Harlan and Colton for their internal review and got a document that read like a list of small decisions no one had meant to add up. In a separate envelope, the bar requested statements from all counsel involved. Rios wrote his on letterhead that smelled faintly of ink and metal and handed me a copy only after he'd mailed it. Charges followed, counts related to forgery and attempted fraud against Victor, misappropriation against Sloane. Plea negotiations started and ended before I could imagine a trial. The agreement arrived dressed in terms of art probation fines, restitution to the company community service hours at the vocational program Edmund had endowed. No prison. Enough of a public record that certain doors would not open the way they once had. I didn't attend the hearing. I drove to St. Bartholomew's instead and sat in a back pew under the repaired roof Edmund had helped fund. A janitor vacuumed in the transept, the machine's whine passing and returning like a tide. When I stepped out into the cold, my phone buzzed with a text from Nora signed and filed. "It's done." I sent back a single period, enough ink to answer no flourish to pretend this was elegant. On paper change is a paragraph. In a building, it is a week of doors opening where they used to stick. I spent mornings in the field with site managers and afternoons with finance learning the work the way Edmund had trained me to learn anything by putting my hands where the problem lived. The stewardship committee met every Friday at 10. On the wall behind my chair we hung the succession sketch Edmund had made with its patient arrows and stubborn loops. The first project we brought back to life was a mill conversion with a clinic on the ground floor and apartments above. The second was smaller, a triangle lot that wanted to be a garden more than it wanted to be a building. Harold Green walked the perimeter with me in boots older than my first job. "You don't fight a corner lot," he said. "You let it pivot." On a Sunday in early summer, I found Sloane waiting outside the workshop, leaning against the brick with sunglasses in her hair and both hands wrapped around a paper cup. The street was empty, except for a cyclist who streaked past as if late to something only he understood. "I'm not here to argue," she said. "I want to return these." She held out a key ring and a small velvet pouch. Inside the pouch were 2 company credit cards and a charm Edmund had bought her when she was 10, a tiny silver wheelbarrow with a single moving wheel. I took the keys and folded them into my palm. "Come in," I said. She looked past me at the shadowy room and shook her head. "Not today." She cleared her throat. "I thought I could do it the way Victor does it." "Make a move, tell the story, keep moving." I didn't see how much I didn't know. She pressed her lips together. "You did." "I'm angry about it, and I'm angry at myself for being angry." We stood like that for a minute, the air holding still between us. "If you want work that isn't ornamental," I said, "there's always too much of it." "I have to settle my other obligations first," she answered. "Then I'll ask again properly." She left without hugging me. It felt right. Helen came by the river lot the following week with 2 folding chairs and a bag of peaches. We sat in the shade of a scaffold and ate over napkins, watching a crane move steel like a fisherman lifts a net. She wore her wedding ring on a chain and never touched it. "I told Victor I'm filing," she said. He nodded as if I'd presented a motion. Then he asked if we could hold off for optics until the fiscal year closed. I told him optics are for cameras. I laughed in a way that surprised us both. She smiled, and then she did touch the ring just once and let it fall. The first annual meeting came with an agenda heavy enough to bow a table. Edith and Harold opened it, then recused themselves for the board election. The vote was not dramatic. It was a row of hands going up for what had already been happening in daylight. After the staff gathered in the loading bay where celebratory things could be messy, someone brought a sheet cake that said "Welcome Home" in blue frosting. A carpenter I'd never met shook my hand with sawdust still soft on his knuckles and said, "We're ready to pour Tuesday, boss." The word boss landed like a tool I'd always seen but only now lifted. Late that night, I went back to the workshop alone and brought Edmund's letters out from the file. I read the first and then the second, and then I put them away and opened the window that sticks unless you lift and push at the same time. The river moved under the moon in long, slow sentences. Somewhere upriver, a barge thrummed deep enough to reorder your ribs. On the drafting table lay the certified will beneath the ship's wheel paperweight, the redundancy page beside it, a small geometry of ink and intention that had held when everything else had leaned. In the morning, I unlocked the office early and walked through the halls before the lights woke. Each door had a story with it, names of sites we'd built, sums penciled on masking tape from meetings when no printer was handy, a handprint at child height on a glass wall from a day a staffer brought a toddler in and no one pretended the smear was a problem. In the conference room, the stewardship diagram still hung, but the temporary flags were down. On the whiteboard, someone had drawn a square for the next project with a question mark at the corner where a garden might pivot. I turned on the kettle, stacked the agendas for the 10 o'clock, and set Edmund's measuring wheel against the wall near my chair. The numbers on the face had faded, but the click it made when the rubber rolled forward was the same as the first day he handed it to me. I pressed the handle and felt it settle into my palm, familiar weight-fitted shape. Outside, crews began to arrive, the lot filling with the everyday clatter that means something is being made. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.